Officer Cole Britten thought he was pulling over a wealthy black couple who had no business driving a car that expensive through his county. He thought the man in the charcoal suit, both hands on the wheel. Voice-controlled citing Supreme Court case law from memory was just another driver who had learned the words, but not the power behind them. He was wrong on every count. The man he called boy on a dark highway that night was the FBI's assistant special agent in charge of violent crimes and public corruption for the entire federal district. And by the time Britten understood that the trap had already closed on him, on his district attorney, on his judge, and on 9 years of organized highway robbery that had been hiding behind a badge in plain sight. This is that story. The city had been generous with them tonight. The restaurant was a quietly elegant Italian place on the 14th floor of a downtown tower, the kind of establishment where the lighting was always calibrated to be just soft enough, and the service was always unhurried, in a way that felt like a gift. Marcus and Diana Webb had spent 3 hours up there above the traffic and the noise and the relentless grinding forward machinery of their respective careers. They had eaten slowly. They had ordered the tiramisu, even though Diana always said she wouldn't, and Marcus had watched her eat it with the particular private joy he reserved for moments when the woman he had loved for 18 years surprised him by choosing pleasure over restraint. 18 years. It was a number that felt both impossibly long and criminally short, depending on which memory Marcus was holding when he thought about it. Tonight, driving south on the 2-lane highway that connected the city to Cedarwood Heights, he was holding all the good ones. The early apartment on Delancey Street with the radiator that worked only when it wanted to. The morning Diana called him from the office bathroom, voice cracking to say she'd made partner. The first night in the Cedarwood Heights house, the two of them sitting on bare hardwood floors, eating takeout from containers, because the furniture hadn't arrived, laughing at themselves for buying a house that was in all honest terms slightly too large and dramatically too suburban for two people who had grown up in the city. They had looked at each other across the empty room that night with the specific expression of people who have taken a calculated risk and aren't sure yet whether they are brave or foolish. 14 months later, they were certain they were brave. Diana's head rested against the passenger window, her eyes half closed, the burgundy dress she had chosen for tonight, catching the occasional warm glow of passing headlights. She was humming quietly, almost to herself, a Stevie Wonder melody that had been playing in the restaurant and apparently decided to follow her out into the night. Her heels were off, kicked into the footwell somewhere around the first mile marker south of the city, and Marcus had said nothing because he loved that about her. The way she shed the formal architecture of a professional evening the moment it was over, becoming herself again, by degrees the real Diana emerging through the layers of Diana who had to perform. Marcus drove with one hand loosely on the wheel. The charcoal jacket was still crisp. The tie had been folded into his breast pocket, somewhere between dessert and the elevator undone, with the practiced indifference of a man who had been wearing suits his entire career and no longer thought about them. He felt settled, content. The specific, rare contentment of a man who has earned a quiet night and is fully present inside one. The highway south of the city was always dark at this hour. That was the first thing they had learned about Cedarwood Heights. The approach road, a long tunnel of 2-lane asphalt flanked by dense Virginia pine, had a quality of darkness that city people weren't built for. No streetlights for 8 miles. Just the towering trees pressing in from both sides, swallowing the headlight beams, creating a corridor effect. Marcus had driven it dozens of times by now, and no longer noticed it. He was cruising at exactly 45 miles per hour, the posted limit, because he was the kind of man who drove the speed limit not out of fear, but because rules were rules, and he had built his entire career on the architecture of that conviction. Diana murmured something soft and unintelligible and shifted her cheek against the cool glass. Marcus reached forward and turned the music down until it was barely a warmth in the car. Just texture. Just the sound of a good night winding down. He did not see the cruiser until it was already behind him. The blue and white strobes detonated in the rearview mirror, without warning an explosive, aggressive eruption of light that hit Marcus in the eyes like a physical impact. Diana came upright instantly, the half-sleep gone from her face in a fraction of a second, replaced by something tighter and older and deeply familiar. Her hand shot forward and snapped the stereo off. The warm hum of the car vanished. In its place came the siren, a single sharp, punishing whoop, and beneath it, beneath everything, Marcus heard his own heartbeat suddenly very deliberate in his ears. He checked the speedometer. 43. He checked his lane position. Dead center. Exact. Were you? No, Marcus said. His voice had already shifted into the cadence he used when the situation required him to be the calmest person in the room. Quiet, measured, placed with care, right on the dot. He activated the right turn signal, slowed without jerking, eased onto the gravel shoulder, killed the engine, and did the things he had trained himself to do over 22 years of understanding that the world did not always extend good faith. He rolled all 4 windows down, switched on the interior dome light, placed both hands on the top of the steering wheel, fingers spread wide and visible, and left them there. Stay calm, he said quietly. Not because Diana needed to be told. He said it the way you say certain things to the person you love, not as instruction, but as accompaniment. He glanced at her sideways. She was sitting perfectly upright, the burgundy dress suddenly incongruous against the hard blue strobing of the police lights, and he could see the tightening in her jaw, that particular clenching of the muscles that he had watched happen 100 times in 100 different contexts. In boardrooms, when a client talked over her. In the lobby of their HOA, when the property manager called her honey on first meeting. At grocery stores, when a stranger's gaze followed her a beat too long. The exhaustion of a woman who had spent her entire professional life being brilliant and credentialed and impeccably composed, and who had never once fully outrun the specific tax of having to prove what she already was. In the rearview mirror, the silhouette of the officer stepped out of the cruiser. He did not approach. He stood behind his open door for a long, deliberate stretch of time, 90 seconds. Marcus counted, and he shone a high-powered spotlight directly into the rearview mirror. A blinding white wall engineered to disorient, to destabilize, to tilt the power balance before a single word had passed between them. Marcus recognized the tactic with the cold, clinical precision of a man who had studied it from both sides of the badge. He did not flinch. He breathed. He waited. The boots hit the gravel. He walked slowly. Not the unhurried stride of a man without urgency, but the deliberate, weighted pace of someone who understood that pace itself was a form of dominance. Each footstep announced itself on the gravel. When he reached the rear of the sedan, he placed one flat palm on the trunk, a proprietary gesture casual, and practiced a fingerprint left on purpose, and then continued forward. He came to the passenger side window. Not the driver's, the passenger side. A calculated choice. It forced Marcus to turn his body awkwardly, presenting his back. It placed Diana sitting in her anniversary dress, hands now folded in her lap, with the controlled stillness of a woman, suppressing something very large directly in the flashlight's first sweep. The beam moved across the interior with slow, inventory-taking deliberateness. It paused on Diana's leather handbag, lingered on the center console, where Marcus's watch caught the light and held it. Then it settled on Marcus's face. Marcus held the gaze through the beam. Officer Cole Britten was 38 years old, though the accumulated residue of years spent cultivating resentment made him look older. His face was the kind that had probably been unremarkable in youth and had since developed character exclusively through bitterness. The jaw held in a permanent confrontational line, the eyes carrying a flat, calculating watchfulness that was not quite intelligence, but had learned over time to imitate it. His buzz cut had grown out unevenly at the sides. His uniform shirt was untucked on the right hip, a small disorder he was either unaware of or didn't care about. His boots, Marcus noted, were the single exception worn at the heel, but polished to a mirror finish. The only disciplined thing about him. The smell arrived before the words did. Stale coffee and spearmint gum. Evening, Britten said. Not good evening. Just the word stripped of its greeting function deployed as a minimum viable human sound. Good evening, Officer Marcus replied, keeping his tone smooth and without heat. How can I help you? Britten didn't answer. His eyes moved from Marcus to Diana and back again, slow and deliberate. License, registration, proof of insurance, he said. Officer Marcus said carefully, each syllable placed with precision before I reach into the glove compartment. May I ask why I was pulled over? Something shifted in Britten's posture. A centimeter of realignment in the shoulder. A slight forward tilt. And Marcus cataloged it, the way he cataloged everything. Britten's right hand, which had been resting on his belt, drifted 3 inches toward the grip of his service weapon and settled there. You crossed the center line back at mile marker 6, Britten said. He delivered it with the flat, prepackaged confidence of a man who has made this statement so many times, it has lost all relationship to truth. Hand over the documents. Or do you want to make this difficult, boy? The word dropped into the car, like something thrown from a height. Boy, said softly, said the way you'd say friend wearing the costume of informality and carrying something else entirely in its luggage. Diana's hand flew to her mouth. Marcus felt the heat rise in his cheek, that specific familiar burn of a man containing something that has every right to refuse containment. But his eyes did not change. They remained exactly what they needed to be, level, dark, and absolutely implacably calm. He had stood in the presence of men who moved product across 3 international borders. He had sat across interrogation tables from people who maintained their innocence with such serene conviction that new agents sometimes wavered. He had faced down the kind of power that had never once been asked to justify itself. A bigoted county deputy with rehearsed cruelty was not in any measurable sense the most dangerous thing Marcus Webb had ever been in a room with. I assure you, he said, holding the cadence, I maintained my lane perfectly. But I'll comply. My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. My wallet is in my left breast pocket. I'm going to reach across slowly and open the glove box now. Every movement narrated before it was made. Every action telegraphed a full second in advance. Hands in full view throughout. Marcus nodded to Diana. She opened the glove box with fingers that trembled only slightly. The kind of trembling that occurs when a person has compressed a very large emotion into a very small space, and the body refuses to be entirely complicit in the suppression. She retrieved the registration card and the insurance document and passed them to Marcus. He used precisely 2 fingers to extract his driver's license from his wallet and handed the entire stack through the window to Britten. Britten snatched them, did not look at them, held them at his side and leaned his forearms against the door frame, bringing his face uncomfortably close to the window, invading the space, claiming it, filling it with his physical presence, in a way that was designed to feel like a form of ownership. Nice car, he said, flashlight sweeping the dashboard slowly. Pretty expensive for around here. Whose is it? It's mine, Marcus said. Is that right? Not a question. He finally shone the beam on the license, read the name, read the address, Cedarwood Heights, the new Ridgeview development. You just move in. 14 months ago, Diana said. Her voice was tight but present, courageous in the way voices are courageous when their owners have chosen engagement over erasure. Britten shifted the flashlight from the license to Diana's face and then moved it slowly down across her dress. It was not a look that belonged in a professional interaction. It had no relationship to law enforcement procedure. Marcus felt something cold move through him, not fear, but its older and quieter sibling. The emotion that lives just beneath the surface of every protective instinct a person carries. I was talking to the driver, ma'am, Britten said. Keep quiet, unless spoken to. Officer. Marcus's voice did not rise, but it changed. The polite scaffolding came down, and what was beneath it was something that carried real weight, low, resonant. The tone of a man who does not require volume to fill a room. Don't speak to my wife that way. You have my documents. Run them. Write the citation if you believe I committed a violation, and let us be on our way. Britten stared at him for a long beat. Then he laughed. A grating, mirthless sound. Got a lot of mouth on you, Hastings. He stepped back and unclipped his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I need a secondary unit past the county line marker. Suspicious vehicle, uncooperative driver. I'm going to pull him out. Diana's breath hitched. It's going to be fine, Marcus murmured, not moving his eyes from Britten. He said it with the deliberate steadiness of a man whose job it is to believe the words, even when the supporting evidence is imperfect. He knew exactly what was happening. He had a technical name for it. Contempt of cop. The phenomenon by which a citizen's failure to be sufficiently deferential becomes reinterpreted by a certain kind of officer as provocation. Marcus's composure had registered to Britten not as compliance, but as challenge, his calm as defiance, his legal knowledge as threat. And now Britten was manufacturing probable cause out of bruised pride layer by fabricated layer, hoping that somewhere in the escalation, Marcus would raise his voice, make a sudden movement, or offer a single degree of justification for what Britten so badly wanted to do. Marcus had no intention of giving him anything. Step out of the vehicle, Britten ordered. Now, Marcus complied. He stated clearly for the record that he recognized the authority to issue an exit order during a lawful stop, and that he was complying voluntarily and under duress. He cited Pennsylvania versus Mims by name. Britten looked momentarily thrown a flicker of confusion. His arrogance immediately paved over, and Marcus stepped out into the cold night air, turned to face the pines, placed his hands flat on the roof, and stood there in his charcoal suit on the gravel shoulder and said nothing. Inside the car, Diana's phone came out. She held it low, camera angled up through the window, framing Britten clearly in the shot. Her hands were steadier now. The fear hadn't left, it was still pressing at her chest. But alongside it, something had appeared that was resolute and cold, and understood exactly what it was holding. Britten spotted the phone. He charged the passenger window voice, spiking threatening arrest for interfering with a police investigation. Marcus told him calmly from his position at the car roof that his wife had a First Amendment right to record police activity in a public space. Britten spun back toward Marcus, the mag light raised high in his grip, in a gesture that had nothing to do with illumination and everything to do with the implicit suggestion of what a metal flashlight could do to a human skull. You move again, Britten said, his voice gone quiet, in the particular way that suggests the removal of the last restraint, and I put you on this asphalt. Do you understand me? Marcus looked at the raised flashlight. He looked at Britten's hand, white-knuckled, trembling faintly. The specific trembling of a man who has exceeded his own emotional capacity and is operating now on adrenaline and wounded ego. He looked at the genuine unhinged aggression in Britten's eyes. This was not poor training. Poor training produced hesitation. This was something older and more deliberate. This was malice wearing a county sheriff's uniform and 14 years of uninterrupted practice. I understand, Marcus said. I'm not moving, Britten breathed. The maglite went back to his hip. Good, he said. The quiet return of his voice was somehow worse than the shouting had been. Because I'm going to search this vehicle. I smell marijuana. Marcus turned his head just enough to meet Britten's eyes directly. You do not smell marijuana, he said. The temperature of each word was absolute zero. I don't consent to a search of my vehicle. You have no probable cause, no warrant, and no lawful authority to enter my property. Don't need your consent, Britten said, and the smile that accompanied it lived at the precise intersection of certainty and cruelty. Narcotics smell gives me all the probable cause I need. He reached for the handle of the back door. Marcus made a decision. He had what he needed. He understood this with the cold, inventory-taking precision of a man who has spent 22 years constructing federal cases, and who knows, at the cellular level, exactly what admissible evidence looks like, and when enough of it exists to build something indestructible. He had the fabricated swerve caught on Diana's camera before Britten had even reached the window, recording 45 perfect miles per hour and dead center lane position. He had 3 fabricated pretexts, each stated clearly within range of the microphone: the lane violation, the alcohol smell, the marijuana. He had the mag light raised over Diana's head. He had a weapon at half-draw. He had the word boy, delivered casually, caught on camera, complete and undeniable. But more than the evidence, he had Britten's hand on the door latch. And if Britten opened that door, he would search the car and find nothing, because there was nothing to find. And the search itself, the violation of it, the spectacle of this man tearing through their anniversary night with fabricated authority on a dark county highway, was a damage Marcus was not willing to absorb. He had been patient. He had been meticulous. He had provided every opportunity for Britten to reverse course, and Britten had responded to each one by accelerating. The performance was over. "Diana," he said, quiet, settled, the specific tone of a man who has ended one calculation and begun the next. She looked at him through the window. Even through the chaos and the strobing blue light, she found his eyes, and something shifted in her face. She knew that tone, had known it for 18 years, had watched it emerge in moments when the professional architecture Marcus wore in the world came down to reveal the person beneath it. The person who did not operate from fear, who operated from clarity. "Center console," he said. "Beneath the insurance papers. Black leather folio. Pass it through the driver's window." Britten's head came up from the door latch. His weapon came out, not raised barrel toward the ground, but unholstered and ready, and he screamed at Diana to put her hands on the dashboard, not to reach for anything, not to move. "Put the firearm away," Officer Britten, Marcus said. And it was not the words that made Britten pause. Britten had heard those words before, and they had never stopped him. It was the complete and total absence of desperation in Marcus's voice. He did not sound like a man asking for mercy. He sounded like a man issuing a directive that he expected to be followed because directives he issued were followed. Britten hesitated. Diana's hands were steady. Later, when Marcus asked how she had kept her hands steady with a weapon pointed toward her on a dark highway, she would say simply, "I trusted you. I have trusted you for 18 years. I wasn't going to stop on the side of a county road." She opened the center console, found the folio black leather substantial worn soft at the corners from daily use across 2 decades, and passed it through the open driver's window. Marcus caught it in his right hand without looking. He held it. 1 beat. 2. His eyes during these 2 beats were on Britten's face, reading it, cataloging every micro-expression, filing it away with the automatic, unstoppable thoroughness of a man for whom observation has long since stopped being a skill and become simply the way his eyes work. Then slowly, with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who understands that pace is power and that he holds all of it, Marcus flipped the folio open and extended it into the beam of backup Officer Garrett Reed's flashlight. Reed had arrived 4 minutes earlier in a second Harlow County cruiser and was standing 8 feet away, looking increasingly uncomfortable in the way that people look when they sense too late that they have walked into something they cannot walk back out of. The badge caught Reed's light first. Gold. Substantial. The specific density and texture that separated a real federal shield from every imitation that had ever tried to approximate it. It didn't glint. It didn't flash. It held the light a sustained heavy luminescence that came from something built to last and designed to be unambiguous. Reed's face moved through its changes in rapid, visible succession. Confusion, the slight furrow of encountering unexpected information. Recognition rising behind the confusion like a tide coming in. Then the color left his face. Not a figure of speech, A literal, observable, physiological event, the blood withdrawing from the surface of his skin with such speed that he visibly paled in the strobing blue light. An involuntary step backward. His hand, which had been near his belt, fell completely away from his body. The credentials panel read, with the unambiguous clarity of something that required no supporting documentation, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Marcus Webb, Supervisory Special Agent, Assistant Special Agent in Charge, Violent Crimes and Public Corruption Division. Reed found his voice. "Cole," he said, and then again louder because Britten still hadn't seen it. "Cole, look at what he's holding." Britten turned the flashlight toward the folio in Marcus's hand. His brain worked at it, reached for an alternate interpretation, found none. And the realization did not arrive gradually. It did not recede or drain in slow degrees. It fell, all at once, the way a structure falls when its foundation is removed. The set of the jaw, the practiced sneer, the flat predatory certainty in the eyes, all of it simply stopped holding and collapsed, leaving behind something pale and small and entirely without cover. His weapon hand shook so violently it took him 3 attempts to find the holster. Marcus closed the folio. He slipped it into his breast pocket with one smooth motion and turned to face Cole Britten with the full, unhurried weight of everything he was. He did not perform this. He did not announce it. His posture simply changed the way the air in a room changes when the person who actually holds the authority in it stops pretending otherwise. Marcus was a broad-shouldered man, and 22 years of professional discipline had given him a particular kind of contained physicality, a restraint that people who worked alongside him understood instinctively as evidence of enormous reserves. He did not need volume. Everything about him suggested quietly and completely that volume was available to him as an option he had simply chosen not to deploy. He stood on the gravel shoulder of that dark highway, and he let Cole Britten look at him for a full 5 seconds. "I am Assistant Special Agent in Charge, Marcus Webb," he said. His voice carried in the pine-flanked air without effort, clean and absolute. "I command the Violent Crimes and Public Corruption Division for this federal district. And as of this moment, every fabrication you put on record tonight is federal evidence." He paused, letting that settle like sediment. "You had one job, Officer Britten. One job. And you used it to hunt people." He turned to Reed. "Call your sheriff." Britten's mouth moved. Sound emerged, but it was not language yet. It was the raw, unfiltered vocalization of a man whose identity could not process what his eyes were seeing. He took a stumbling half-step backward. His hands came up in front of his chest, in a placating gesture that looked involuntary, as though his arms had moved without instruction from his brain. "Sir Agent Webb, I didn't know. I thought it was dark. The car, You didn't know," Marcus said. The voice had not risen a single degree. "Let me be precise about what you didn't know, so we are both clear about the nature of this conversation. You did not know that the man you called boy on a public road without probable cause, without any traffic violation, without any legitimate law enforcement justification whatsoever, held a federal rank higher than your sheriff, your precinct captain, and your district attorney. Is that accurate?" Britten's eyes went to his boots. "Yes, sir." "Then let me ask you something," Marcus said. "Is that the threshold? Is a federal badge the qualifying credential for basic constitutional adherence in this county? Because I need to understand whether the Fourth Amendment applies to the residents of Cedarwood Heights, conditionally based on the contents of their glove compartment, or whether there is some other standard operating here that I am not aware of." The words were not hostile. They were precise. And that precision was more devastating than hostility would have been, because precision implies documentation, and documentation implies record, and record implies consequence, the one thing Cole Britten had operated without for 14 years. Reed was standing 3 feet behind Britten, with his hands clearly away from his body, telegraphing non-aggression with every available inch of his posture. A young deputy named Forsyth who had arrived with Reed and had been on the force for 11 months, had positioned himself near the tree line with the careful peripheral distance of a man already calculating his own exposure. Britten tried again. The words tumbled over each other, now stripped of all the practiced authority that had animated them an hour ago. Family, mortgage, dark, misread the situation. We can walk away from this. I'll void the stop. You'll never see me on this highway again, I swear. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then James Holloway, he said. Britten went completely still. Not a flinch, a cessation. All movement in him simply stopped. The man you pulled over on this exact stretch of highway 6 months ago. Marcus said, his voice dropping further the way pressure drops before weather arrives. 3 children in the back seat. You tore his vehicle apart for 45 minutes on a fabricated drug suspicion, left him with an impound bill he couldn't afford, and drove away without a citation because there was no citation to write. He was afraid to report it. Did you think about his family then? Officer Britten's mouth opened. How do you know? Because I am the FBI. Marcus said, each word arriving with the weight of a fact being placed on a table, and we know things. He held the man's eyes for 3 more seconds. Then he pulled his phone from his pocket. The call to Sheriff Frank Dowd lasted 4 minutes. Marcus made it standing on the shoulder of the highway in full view of all 3 deputies, his voice never rising above a conversational register. The calm, sequential, permanent voice of someone who has made thousands of official statements and understands exactly what language survives in the record. Illegal stop. No traffic infraction. 3 fabricated pretexts for search on recorded audio. Service weapon drawn and directed toward his wife during a non-threatening document retrieval. Everything captured on 2 separate video recordings. He requested the sheriff's personal presence. He stated clearly that no deputies were to leave the scene. Dowd arrived in 11 minutes. Marcus timed it. The unmarked vehicle came around the pine tree bend fast and pulled hard onto the shoulder, and Sheriff Frank Dowd was out of it before it fully stopped, half-dressed uniform jacket thrown over civilian clothes. Face carrying the particular expression of a man who understood from the first sentence of the phone call that he was driving toward something that was going to define a significant portion of his immediate future. Dowd looked at the scene with the quick cataloging gaze of a law enforcement veteran, the pristine dark blue sedan with all 4 windows down. Marcus Webb, standing beside it in a charcoal suit, federal folio, visible at his breast pocket. Diana in the passenger seat, phone still recording. Britten on the gravel, pale and visibly trembling. Reed near the cruiser, hands away from his body. Forsyth at the tree line. Dowd walked directly to Marcus. They spoke for 90 seconds. Dowd listening, Marcus precise and concise. When Marcus finished, Dowd turned without changing his pace and walked to Britten, and he extended his palm open and upward and said Britten's name and said nothing else. Britten reached up with fingers that shook and unclipped his badge from his chest. He unholstered his sidearm, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber with the mechanical muscle memory motions of a man performing a procedure while his mind has gone somewhere else entirely, and laid everything in Dowd's open palm. He stood on the dark highway in his untucked uniform and his polished boots, and he wept. Not with remorse. Marcus had spent enough years in the company of human grief to distinguish between tears of remorse and tears of consequence, and these were entirely the latter. But with the raw animal panic of a man watching the infrastructure of his impunity disassemble itself in real time. Reed put him in the back of the cruiser. Marcus stood on the gravel and breathed. Behind him, through the open passenger window, Diana reached out and touched his arm, just the tips of her fingers on his sleeve, and he reached back and covered her hand with his without turning around. The pine trees stood in their long rows and said nothing. Marcus was at his desk before sunrise. He filed the preliminary Title 18 U.S.C. Section 242 complaint at 6:14. Read it back once. It was clean, thorough, and would hold. He submitted it and set it aside. And then he sat with the thing that had settled in his chest somewhere in the night and refused to move. He had spent 22 years working in the space between what institutions say they are and what they actually do. And he had learned to recognize a specific quality of unease, not anxiety, not exhaustion, but a steady impersonal pressure that said, keep pulling. A patrolman does not develop the kind of casual, rehearsed impunity he had witnessed on that highway in isolation. That texture of cruelty, bored, practiced entirely unconcerned with accountability, was the product of an environment that had decided at some level above the individual that the behavior was acceptable, that it would not be punished, that the machinery existed to absorb any complaint that arose from it. He opened a fresh file. Special Agent Yvonne Patterson arrived at 7:15 with coffee in each hand and the look of a woman who had also been awake since 5 and had made peace with it. Patterson was 41 with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of methodical forensic intelligence that manifested as a near-pathological comfort with large and complicated data sets. She had spent 8 years in financial crimes before joining Marcus's division, and she had the best eye in the office for the way money moved when it was trying not to be seen. She pulled Britten's dashcam archive, sat with it for 3 hours. What she found had the quality of something that had been waiting to be found, a pattern so consistent in its mechanics that it suggested not individual misconduct, but coordinated institutional practice. Dozens of documented malfunctions, the camera cutting out the recording, dropping each occurring with uncanny precision in the window between the initiation of a traffic stop and its resolution, and each stop involving a driver whose documentation, license plate, or physical appearance placed them outside the demographic profile of Cedarwood Heights and its surrounding communities. The microphones had kept running on many of them, though. Patterson played Marcus segments of audio over the course of the morning. He listened with his hands flat on the desk and his face entirely still, and his mind moving through the recordings with the cold, relentless efficiency of a person adding to a case file rather than processing an emotion. He would process the emotion later. Right now, he was building something. The spiral notebook was recovered from Britten's cruiser locker during the suspension inventory that same morning. Small, cheap wire-bound. Patterson laid it open on the conference table, and they looked at it together. It was a ledger. Handwritten in cramped left slanting script, dates, locations, dollar amounts, and 2 sets of initials appearing at the end of each entry. Britten's own cut, per Patterson's arithmetic, was 20%. The remaining 80% flowed upward to whoever belonged to those 2 sets of initials. Patterson said, "I need to follow the money." Marcus said, "Follow it." She came back to him 4 hours later, and she laid the financial trail out on the conference table between them with the clean, sequential precision of someone presenting a case rather than making one. The money led to a discretionary municipal fund controlled exclusively by 2 men. Richard Calder, Harlow County District Attorney, 15 years in office. Silver-haired country club membership election margins that never dipped below 12 points. A man who ran on law and order every 4 years and had never once been asked in 15 years to explain what law meant to the people being robbed on the highway that connected his county to the city. Warren Stills, presiding civil court judge, former state prosecutor. Known in legal circles for 2 things: the severity of his sentencing in minor drug offenses and the speed with which he processed asset forfeiture petitions. The speed, Patterson had discovered, was less a virtue than a mechanism. The petitions went through without formal hearings, without evidentiary review, without any of the procedural architecture that the law required, because the man sitting on the bench had decided that the bench was something he personally owned. Marcus looked at the web of transactions on Patterson's screen. He looked at the dates. He looked at the amounts. Then he said, "Pull their phones. All of it. I want wire intercepts authorized by the federal magistrate in the capital, not local courts, not anyone in this county. We go dark, and we go deep." Patterson nodded. She was already reaching for her legal pad. "One more thing," Marcus said. He looked at the ledger at the dates at the highway mile markers noted beside each entry. "How long has this been running?" Patterson looked at the earliest date in the notebook. She looked at him. 9 years, she said. Marcus sat with that number for a moment. 9 years. The length of a child growing from birth to the age when they start asking questions about how the world works and expecting the answers to be honest. 9 years of a dark highway, being used as a collection instrument. 9 years of people driving home from the city, driving home from work, driving home to their families, and being pulled over and robbed and terrorized and left on the gravel shoulder with nothing to show for it, and no mechanism for complaint that didn't feel from where they were standing, like walking into a second trap. "Draft the applications," he said. "We're filing tomorrow morning." The investigation went classified and deep, and it operated in absolute silence. No coordination with the Harlow County Sheriff's Department. No local court filings. No communication with anyone whose institutional loyalty had not been independently established and verified. The wire intercepts went live in the second week of December, authorized by a federal magistrate in the state capital, who read the preliminary evidence package in a single sitting and signed the applications with the expression of someone who had been expecting something like this for a while without knowing where to look. Marcus drove to the satellite office early and left late. He drank too much black coffee. He slept 5 hours on the good nights and 4 on the rest. Patterson ran the financial threads with the slow archaeological patience of someone excavating something fragile and important, never pulling too hard, never disturbing the surrounding material, just carefully and continuously removing what surrounded the truth until the shape of the thing became visible. Diana became his anchor in the way that only someone who has spent 18 years truly understanding another person can be. She did not ask him to stop. She had never asked him to stop a case before it was finished in 22 years of marriage, and she was not about to start now, because she knew with the particular clarity of a woman who had built her own career on the belief that the work matters, that this case was not separate from what had happened to them on the highway. It was the same thing in a larger body, with a longer history and more victims and a more carefully constructed architecture of protection around it. Leaving it unfinished would be a form of abandonment of every person who had experienced it without the resources to fight back. But she also knew what this level of sustained effort cost him. On the nights he came home with the hollow-eyed, scraped-thin look of a man running on the wrong side of his reserves, she made dinner and sat across from him, and did not fill the silence with anything unnecessary. She understood that sometimes the most sustaining thing another person can offer is simply their quiet, present company. She was very good at it. James Holloway knocked on their door on a Thursday evening in November. Holloway was their neighbor, 3 houses down, a 44-year-old building contractor, soft-spoken, who had introduced himself when they moved in with a plate of his wife's cornbread and a handshake that was warm and genuine and required nothing in return. Marcus knew him as a good neighbor, someone whose lawn was tidy, whose children were polite, who waved from his driveway in the mornings without any agenda. He stood at their door that Thursday evening and told them what had happened to him 6 months before the night of their traffic stop. Same highway, same darkness. Britten had lit him up, told him he'd run a stop sign that didn't exist, spent 45 minutes dismantling his work truck while Holloway stood on the shoulder with his hands visible and his 3 children watching from the back seat. When Holloway had asked him to stop, Britten had told him to be quiet. When it ended, there was no citation because there was no violation, and Britten had driven away without explanation, leaving Holloway to explain to his children on the side of a dark road what had just happened and why. Holloway had been too afraid to report it. He had a business. He had employees. He had a mortgage on a house 3 doors from theirs, and he had made the brutal, pragmatic calculation that filing a complaint against a Harlow County deputy in a Harlow County court was a risk he could not afford. He had driven a different route home from his job site for 3 months after. He had kept it between himself and his wife. He told Marcus, because he had heard through the careful network of neighbors and community members that something had happened on that highway involving the FBI. And he thought, he said, choosing his words with the deliberate care of a man who has been waiting for the right door to knock on, that it was time someone knew. Marcus called Patterson the next morning. He told her to open a confidential intake line, secure federal level with full identity protection for anyone who used it. 31 people called within 3 weeks. Their accounts were different in their details and identical in their structure. Same highway, same fabricated violation, the same progression escalation fabricated narcotics, suspicion vehicle search, cash seized, no receipt, no evidence log, no record of the stop being entered correctly into the system. The driver left on the shoulder of a dark highway with nothing, no legal standing, no documentation, no record that what had happened to them had happened at all. They were black and Hispanic. They were construction workers and nurses and small business owners, and a retired school principal driving to see her grandchildren, and a 23-year-old college student heading home. They were people who had made the same calculation James Holloway had made, that the complaint was a cost they could not afford to pay in a county whose legal infrastructure had given them no reason to believe the complaint would arrive anywhere other than a trash bin. Patterson found the shell company in the 6th week of the financial investigation. She called Marcus into the conference room at 9 in the evening. He was still in the office, which at that point in the investigation was not unusual, and she spread the documents across the table and walked him through it with the quiet, methodical energy of someone who has just found the thing they have been looking for and wants to make absolutely certain they have it right before they say so. Calder owned a private consulting firm registered under his ex-wife's maiden name with a post office box address in a neighboring county. No documented clients. Revenue that bore a suspicious and consistent relationship amount timing frequency to the cash flows from Britten's highway ledger. Stills's son-in-law ran a construction company that had won without exception every significant municipal contract put out for bid by the Harlow County government in the past 9 years. Roads, public buildings, the recreation center, the city hall renovation, the precinct fleet. Millions of dollars building by building, contract by contract, all of it traceable back to the same dark highway and the same practiced cruelty and the same calculation that the people being robbed would not have the power to make it stop. Marcus looked at the full picture laid out across the conference table. He stood very still for a long moment. Britten was the blade, he said finally. Calder and Stills built the hand. Patterson looked at him across the table. We have enough for Rico. Get the subpoenas drafted, Marcus said. Phone taps, bank records, email servers, every text message they've sent in 9 years. We want everything. And we want it so airtight that there is no thread left to pull on. He looked at the documents one more time, at the dates, at the amounts, at the names of 31 people who had been robbed in the dark by men who wore the instruments of public trust as personal accessories. We don't just want the tail, he said. We want the head. He submitted the full package to the DOJ Civil Rights Division in Washington on a Thursday in February. The cover letter was 3 pages of facts. No rhetoric, just evidence, just numbers, just names, just the verdict the evidence demanded. The Pine Ridge Country Club sat at the end of a private road, flanked by old-growth maples. Its main building, a white colonial structure with a circular drive, and the unhurried, self-assured atmosphere of a place where money was old enough to have stopped needing to announce itself. On the second Saturday in March, it hosted the Harlow County Civic Excellence Gala, Richard Calder's annual fundraiser, black tie, $500 a plate, attended by every person in the county who considered themselves influential enough to require the company of others who agreed. Calder was in his element. He stood at the center table of the main dining room, in a bespoke tuxedo, holding court, with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 30 years learning that the room always feels manageable when you are the one making it laugh. Around him, donors and officials and businessmen leaned in with the attentive, agreeable postures of people who understood that proximity to Richard Calder was a form of currency and were committed to its maintenance. His champagne glass was raised. He was mid-sentence, something about the generosity of the community, the continued prosperity of Harlow County, the privilege of shared purpose among distinguished company. He felt completely invincible. Britten had taken the fall. The FBI had conducted its initial raid on the precinct and then apparently moved on. The investigation seemed to have concluded. The slush fund was intact. The shell company had not surfaced in any public filing. The story was as far as Calder could determine over. He was mid-word, champagne glass tilted crystal catching the chandelier light, the room smiling up at him when the dining room doors opened. The ambient chatter did not taper. It stopped. All at once, as though a switch had been thrown. No sirens had preceded them. No announcement. No warning of any kind. 18 federal agents in FBI-marked tactical vests entered the dining room in complete silence and moved with the fluid, practiced economy of people who have rehearsed this deployment and know precisely where every exit is located. It took 11 seconds from the moment the doors opened to the moment every exit in the room was covered. During those 11 seconds, the room, 300 people in formal dress holding glasses mid-conversation, simply stared without the language for what it was watching. Marcus walked down the center aisle. Dark suit. No tactical vest. Federal badge clipped to his belt visible and understated, requiring no announcement because it did not need one. He walked with the same measured, unhurried pace he had used on the shoulder of the highway in October, the pace that Britten had tried to use on him. And that meant something entirely different when it belonged to the person who actually held the authority. He passed the frozen waitstaff. He passed tables of donors who tracked his movement with the paralyzed attention of people watching something they cannot stop. He did not look at any of them. He walked directly to the center table. He stopped in front of Richard Calder. Calder's champagne glass came down slowly. His eyes moved from Marcus's face to the badge at his belt and back again, and the process of recognition working its way through the composure, through the political instinct, through the layered defenses of 15 years of untouchability, took 4 full seconds. The fundraiser's smile did not fade gradually. It stopped. What replaced it was not fear yet, but the specific rapid tightening of a man whose mind is moving very fast through a list of options and finding each one closed. "What is the meaning of this?" he said. Good voice-controlled, authoritative, projecting the indignation of a man accustomed to treating his own presence as a form of protection. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "This is a private event," Richard Calder, Marcus said, and his voice filled the dead silent room without effort. "District Attorney, Harlow County, 15 years in office, a single beat. You are under arrest for racketeering, extortion, wire fraud, and conspiracy to deprive the civil rights of the people of this county." Calder stood up. His chair went backward. He put his hands on the table and leaned forward, and the outrage in his face was real outrage that the architecture he had spent 9 years building was being dismantled, not in a private room, but in front of his donors, his allies, the entire social ecosystem whose regard he had purchased and maintained at the cost of 31 people on a dark highway. "You cannot barge into a private event," and Agent Patterson, Marcus said. Yvonne Patterson stepped forward from his right with a pair of heavy steel handcuffs and the unhurried professional competence of someone who has done this many times and requires no theatrical framing for it. She moved around the table, took Calder's arm, turned him with practiced efficiency. The steel clicked around his wrists, and then in the vast chandelier-lit absolute silence of the Pine Ridge Country Club dining room, the composure that had survived 9 years of criminal enterprise, 15 years of public office, and 300 witnesses in formal dress, finally gave way. Calder's face went through its changes all at once, the color leaving in a rush, the set of the jaw going slack, the political calculation in the eyes, replaced by something that was simply and completely afraid. His shoulders dropped inside the bespoke tuxedo. He seemed in that moment to become smaller than the suit. Behind him on the table, the champagne glass sat untouched, still catching the chandelier light. Marcus looked at it for one moment. Then he turned away. "You have the right to remain silent," he said, and his voice was completely without triumph. He was working. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Across town at the same moment, the second team was executing the simultaneous warrant at Warren Stills's estate. The judge had apparently received some warning instinct perhaps, or a text that had gone unanswered, because when the agents breached the front door, they found him in his study in his bathrobe at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night, feeding documents into a shredder, with the frantic mechanical urgency of a man who knows exactly how damning the documents are. The forensic team secured the hard drive from his computer before the shredder reached it. They recovered correspondence that made the shell company records look like a preface. Stills wept openly as agents boxed his study. This man who had sentenced hundreds of defendants from the height of the judicial bench, who had looked down at people with the cold, calibrated severity of someone who had decided that the most productive use of judicial power was its most aggressive application, stood in his bathrobe at 11 o'clock at night and wept while agents documented the financial architecture of the criminal enterprise he had built and profited from and protected for 9 years. The untouchables had been touched. The federal courthouse in Harlow County had been built in the 1930s, all limestone and high ceilings, and the enduring grandeur of public buildings, from an era that believed institutions should look as though they intended to last. In March of the following year, the main courtroom on the 3rd floor was at capacity every single day of the 2-week trial. Reporters, legal observers, community members, and in the front rows, sitting together in 6 rows, the 31 men and women who had come forward from the intake line. They did not carry signs. They did not speak to the press in the hallways. They came every morning, and they sat and they watched, and their presence in that gallery, quiet, composed, collective, was without any theatrical gesture, the most powerful statement in the room. Marcus looked at them every morning when he entered the courtroom. He looked at James Holloway in the 3rd row, sitting with his hands folded in his lap, wearing the same careful stillness he had worn on their doorstep that November evening. And he thought about 9 years, and what 9 years costs a person who drives a different route home for 3 months, because the road they have a right to use belongs in practice to someone else. The defense teams were high-priced, imported, armed with motions and objections, and a 3-part strategy suppressed the financial evidence, attacked the investigation's origins, as personal vendetta characterized 9 years of organized highway robbery as administrative sloppiness. They executed this strategy with professional competence, and it failed comprehensively because Patterson had built the financial case with the kind of layered, redundant evidentiary architecture that has no single load-bearing element to attack. Pull one beam and the rest hold. The suppression motions failed. The characterization of administrative error collapsed under the weight of a 9-year pattern. And the attack on the investigation's origins, the suggestion that Marcus had manufactured a federal case because he was embarrassed by a traffic stop, produced on cross-examination the moment the gallery would describe afterward in their various accounts using the same word. Devastating. The defense attorney for Calder was a silver-haired woman from a large Philadelphia firm who approached the witness stand with the measured authority of someone who has won difficult cases in difficult rooms and understands that the appearance of certainty is its own form of argument. Agent Webb, she said, isn't it accurate that this entire federal investigation was initiated because you personally were humiliated during a routine traffic stop in Harlow County? Marcus looked at her. He looked at the jury, 12 faces carrying the expressions of people who had spent 9 days watching a criminal enterprise be reconstructed in documentary detail, and were now watching the person most directly responsible for dismantling it. Be asked whether his motivation was petty. He leaned forward slightly into the microphone. "No," he said. "What's accurate is that Officer Cole Britten pulled my wife and me over with no traffic infraction, fabricated 3 separate pretexts for a search, drew his weapon in the direction of my wife during a non-threatening document retrieval, and used a racial slur that I have spent 22 years watching applied to people who had no mechanism for response. The federal investigation that followed was not about me." He paused. "It was about 31 people who had the same experience on the same highway and couldn't fight back without losing everything they had. I didn't manufacture a case. I turned the lights on in a room these men had been robbing in the dark for 9 years. The room was already there. The crime was already there. I just walked in." The defense attorney returned to her table. The prosecution's final witness entered through the side door in an orange federal prison jumpsuit, wrists and ankles shackled, escorted by 2 marshals. Cole Britten had lost 15 pounds, and all of the weight had come from the parts of him that had previously been occupied by arrogance. The confrontational set of the jaw was gone. The flat, predatory watchfulness of the eyes on the highway was gone. He moved with the deliberate, minimal economy of someone whose body has learned to make itself as inoffensive as possible. He did not look at Marcus when he took the stand. He had received no plea agreement, no reduction in his sentence, which was already being served. He testified because he wanted, he said quietly into the microphone to get it on the record, because he had spent 4 months in a federal corrections facility with nothing to do except sit with what he had done, and he had arrived at something he acknowledged it was probably too late to be called conscience, and he made no claim that it was that he was going to act on anyway. He confirmed the revenue directive. Calder's phrase for it, delivered at a closed-door shift briefing with the procedural language of a man who had decided that policy framing made criminal enterprise administrative. He confirmed that Stills had guaranteed the bench would process forfeiture petitions without formal hearings, without evidentiary review, without any of the procedural infrastructure the law required. He confirmed the percentages, the initials in the ledger, the shell company, the construction contracts. He confirmed the targeting logic, the explicit calculation that people driving certain cars coming from certain places without certain resources would not be able to challenge what was being done to them. When the prosecution rested, the defense rested. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 9 minutes. When the 4-person stood to read the verdict, the gallery was so silent that the building's HVAC system was audible above the breathing of 300 people. Marcus looked at James Holloway in the 3rd row. Holloway was looking at the 4-person. His hands were folded in his lap, and his face was composed and very still, carrying the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have been waiting for something for a very long time and are now at the moment of its arrival, almost too aware of it to react. The 4-person read, "Guilty on racketeering, guilty on extortion, guilty on wire fraud, guilty on conspiracy to deprive civil rights, guilty 9 times for Calder, 8 for Stills." Each word landing in the room like a stone dropped from a height into still water, sending rings outward through the gallery that were visible as shifts in posture, released breath hands that had been pressed flat on thighs finally opening. At the 9th guilty, Richard Calder, who had maintained through 14 days of testimony the composed and slightly contemptuous bearing of a man who believes the situation will resolve itself in his favor, put his head in his hands. The composure that had survived 9 years of criminal enterprise and 2 weeks of federal trial did not survive the 9th reading of a single word. Warren Stills did not move. He stared at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who has arrived after a very long journey at the place he was always going to arrive, and who has nothing left to feel about it. Marcus looked at James Holloway. Holloway was looking back at him. His eyes were steady, and his face was composed, and there was something in the way he held Marcus's gaze across the packed courtroom. Quiet, direct without theatrics or performance, that carried more weight than anything Marcus had heard in 2 weeks of testimony. It was the gaze of a man who drove a different route home for 3 months, because the highway that was his by right had been taken from him, and who was sitting in a federal courtroom, watching that right be formally and permanently returned. Marcus held the look for a moment. Then the gavel came down and the room exhaled. Federal Judge Patricia Hollis was 63 years old, had spent 15 years on the bench, and was known in the legal community for precisely 2 things: the precision of her written opinions and the complete absence of mercy in her sentencing of public officials convicted of abusing their office. She did not view position as a mitigating factor. She had stated this view on the record from the bench in previous hearings. In her judgment, position was an aggravating factor. The authority that a public official carries does not reduce the severity of its abuse. It multiplies it. She sentenced Richard Calder to 22 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. She sentenced Warren Stills to 19 years. She addressed each man directly before delivering the sentence in a voice that had no performance in it, just the clean, measured weight of someone who has thought carefully about what needs to be said and is saying exactly that. To Calder, "You use the machinery of the law, the very machinery built to protect the people of this county, as a personal extraction tool. You understood that certain people in this county lacked the power to protect themselves from you, and you made that understanding the foundation of a criminal enterprise. The harm you have caused is not measurable only in dollars. It is measurable in the fear of a drive home. It is measurable in the calculation a man makes when he decides not to report what was done to him, because the institution that would receive the report is the one that did it." Calder's hands gripped the defense table as the 22 years landed in the room. His knuckles went white, then released, and then he seemed to settle not into acceptance, but into the specific hollow deflation of a man whose body has understood something his mind is still refusing. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, and Calder did not respond to it. To Stills, "The bench is not a commodity. The oath you took was not a formality. You turned both into instruments of extortion, and you did it with the deliberate, sustained calculation of a man who believed the robe would protect him. It will not protect you here." Stills heard his 19 years with his eyes closed. He did not open them when the gavel struck. He sat in his chair with the stillness of a man who has decided to receive what is coming to him without the indignity of a visible reaction. And he held that stillness for a long time after the marshal's hand closed on his shoulder. Their assets were frozen within 48 hours and liquidated over the following 6 weeks. The resulting restitution fund was distributed under the court's supervision to the 31 documented victims, with additional payments to individuals identified in the historical records of the cash seizures who had never come forward. James Holloway received his check on a Tuesday morning in late April. Marcus was backing out of his driveway when Holloway came outside in work clothes, about to leave for a job site, the kind of ordinary weekday morning that is ordinary precisely because nothing has happened to interrupt it. He opened the envelope on the porch. He read the letter once. Then he stood very still for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular, holding the paper loosely at his side. Then he looked up and found Marcus's car at the end of the driveway. He nodded. Once. Slow and private, a nod addressed to no one in particular, and to everything at once. The nod of a man who drove a different route home for 3 months and is now standing on his own porch in the April morning, holding the paper confirmation that the debt incurred by that fear has been formally acknowledged by the country he lives in. Marcus nodded back. Britten was 42 months into his sentence at a federal corrections facility 2 states away. Dowd retained his position. His cooperation had been early and complete, but much of his command staff did not survive the subsequent departmental review. Reed was retained with conditions. Forsyth, the rookie who had backed himself to the tree line on the night of the traffic stop, filed a voluntary resignation in April. In the letter, which Marcus had no official reason to have read, but had Forsyth wrote that he had entered law enforcement to protect people and had learned on a dark highway in October that he was not yet the person capable of doing that, and that before he wore a badge again, he needed to become one. Marcus read it twice, set it down, thought about it for a while. The Harlow County Sheriff's Department was placed under a federal consent decree in June, restructured from patrol protocols to hiring practices to its internal complaint mechanisms, with mandatory federal oversight for a minimum of 5 years. On a Saturday evening in early May, with the weather finally warm enough that the Virginia pines looked green rather than black, Marcus and Diana took a drive. They did not discuss it beforehand. Diana appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7 o'clock, wearing a light jacket and holding her keys, and Marcus looked up from the case file he was reading. Something new from the Pittsburgh office, and closed it. He got his jacket from the hook. They walked to the car together in the last of the evening light, and Marcus drove south without explanation because none was needed. The highway was the same. The pines stood in their long rows on both sides, patient and permanent, swallowing the headlights the way they always had. The darkness past the city limits was the same deep, specific darkness. No streetlights, just the road and the trees and the cool May night coming in through Diana's open window. Marcus drove at 45 miles per hour, both hands on the wheel. The old habit, the ingrained caution that would not fully leave him for a long time, yet perhaps ever, because some things become part of you, regardless of the outcome. They passed mile marker 4, then 5. Mile marker 6 appeared in the headlights and passed beneath the wheels, and Marcus felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the somatic memory of fear. The body's own record of what it had felt to stand on that gravel shoulder in October, with his hands on the roof of the car, and a maglite in his face, and his wife in danger, and the particular terrible knowledge that everything he was and everything he had earned might not be sufficient to protect the person he loved most in the world. The body keeps its own records. They do not always respond to verdicts. And then from the north headlights, a Harlow County cruiser moving toward them on the opposite side of the road. Marcus's hands tightened on the wheel. The reflex unbidden the old readiness, and he felt Diana go still beside him, in the way she went still when she was waiting to see what the next thing would be. The cruiser did not slow down. It did not brake, did not turn around, did not light them up. The officer inside young face, briefly visible in the passing wash of headlights, professional and unremarkable, in the best possible way, glanced across at the dark blue sedan coming south and offered a brief professional nod. The nod of one person on a road to another. The nod of a county deputy doing the ordinary decent work of keeping people safe. And then the cruiser was past them, and its taillights were disappearing around the pine tree bend, and the highway was empty again in both directions. Marcus exhaled. Long, slow, complete. The kind of breath that takes something with it when it goes, that empties a space that has been occupied for a long time by something heavy and unresolvable. He felt the weight leave his shoulders, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the gradual way that weight leaves when it has finally been carried far enough, and the road ahead is clear. Diana reached across the console and placed her hand over his on the wheel. He turned his hand over and took hers. "You can relax now," she said, soft, present, carrying 18 years of knowing exactly when to speak and exactly what to say. "Working on it," Marcus said, and she laughed, a small, warm, real sound that filled the car and spilled out through her open window into the May night, and they drove on through the darkness, through the corridor of pines, through the ordinary and irreplaceable quiet of a road that was theirs, now that belonged to them, the way it belonged to everyone equally and without condition and without having to prove it to anyone. Richard Calder is serving year 1 of 22 in a federal facility where no one calls him district attorney. Warren Stills received his 19 years in the same courtroom where he had processed forfeiture petitions without hearings for 9 years, sitting in the chair where defendants had always sat learning, at last, what the view from that side of the room looks like. Cole Britten is 42 months into his sentence on a quiet wing of a federal corrections facility, and on certain evenings, he reportedly stands at the narrow window of his cell and looks out at whatever small portion of the outside world the window allows. The 31 people who drove south on that highway at night in their work trucks and their family sedans, their borrowed cars and their own cars that someone decided they had no right to drive. They know what happened. They knew before anyone put it on record. They had been knowing it for years in the specific isolated way that people know things that no institution around them wants to hear. What changed was not the knowledge. What changed was the light. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you that accountability is not guaranteed, but it is possible, and that the road to it is long and requires people who refuse to stop pulling the thread, please subscribe to our channel. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told, and we tell every one of them.